Streets of Rage, otherwise known as Bare Knuckle in Japan, I would have to put it down as one of my favourite games of all time, as it was one of those titles that made a huge impact on me as a gamer, while also making a massive impact on the gaming landscape as a whole, which originally would see itself as a direct competitor to Capcom's Final Fight that was massive in the arcades and even on the Super Nintendo, so Sega wanted a piece of that action, and the first Streets of Rage game would be the first of 3 original games that saw releases between 1991 to 1994, with the second game in the series being classed as quite simply the greatest beat 'em up ever, and I would have to agree on that, but at the same time we can't take away from the fact that the original game set the foundations for everything that was to come after it. It really set the benchmark very very high, and it would have taken something really special to knock it off its throne. Over the years the game has seen massive amounts of ports on a multitude of different systems, anywhere from the lesser powered 8-bit consoles with the Sega Master System, even the Game Gear, and these ports do a good job of trying to reenact the elements of the original 16-bit Mega Drive or Genesis version. And even with the Master System edition itself, having grown up with that console, I would put it down as one of the best looking games I've ever seen on it. Even the Game Gear version, although it is very different to that of the Master System, also plays very well indeed. A later port would be added to the Sega CD or Mega CD here in Europe. That would pretty much be the same, but there would be some subtle differences regarding the sound effects. And while it is a good title in its own right, it doesn't have the same impact as the original 16-bit version. I think that's hands down the best edition of that game that's out there, hands down. And it is easy to see why. When you look at all of the modern consoles that have come out over the years, the amount of ports that's still being added even to this day, it's just an iconic game. Pretty much in many ways a masterpiece, just like its sequel, Streets of Rage 2. There is a third one, and yeah, it's a good game, but it just didn't hit the mark in the same way as the original 2 games did, but that'll be for another video. But with the original story, it takes on the role of 3 police officers, with Axel Stone, Blaze Fielding and Adam Hunter, as they combine their resources to fight Mr. X, a crime lord that has taken over the city, getting all his gangs and minions to do all of his dirty work, causing chaos throughout all of the urban areas surrounding the city limits. And with the police and the authorities not doing anything, our 3 heroes have decided to take upon themselves to go out on the streets and to take action in the only way they know how, which is literally to beat the living crap out of anything that moves. The later sequels would add more characters to the roster, but also incorporating various additional story arcs and elements, which are interesting and even led on to the more recent game seen over the last couple of years with Streets of Rage 4, and yet there is another game currently in development by Sega, so that will be interesting in itself to see where that'll go. Each of the characters you play as all have their own distinctive traits, abilities, nuances, and there's various play styles that will suit different characteristics. For me, my favourite character has always been Axel, as I think he's a good solid all-rounder, very strong. He's quick, but at the same time his movesets and his power make up for the lack in some areas, especially with his movement, as yes, he is a bit slower than everybody else, but he's probably got some of the most devastating moves out of any character within the game. Adam would slightly be slower, but he's more agile. He can jump a lot higher, he's a lot more finesse in terms of his kicks and his punches, as he has a boxing background, and he's a very very cool character indeed to use. And the same even can be said with Blaze. She's probably the lightest and the easiest character out of all of them to use, because she can move around so quickly, and she probably has the most versatile moveset out of all of the characters, but would be slightly weaker in terms of power and damage. But they all play their part, and will all be useful, especially if you're playing in the multiplayer mode or co-op mode, which was definitely the highlight reel for this game. Even its later sequels, if you've ever played any of the Streets of Rage games, they're always best played with a friend if you have a second controller. I know with the later game there's more controllers or more people that can be added for even more chaos. So with the original game itself, there's 8 levels, and the main goal is to go through different scenarios or scenes, anywhere from rundown streets to motorway bridges, factories, even a boat or a ship, to get to the final tower to face off against the final boss, which will be Mr. X himself. But what's interesting with this element of the game compared to the other games that would later follow is that there is a choice-based system later on, and depending on the choices you can get one or two outcomes, which will lead to either a good or bad ending. Whereas if you choose wrongly, you will end up becoming the leader of the city, but not essentially in a good way. Or you can decide to just do the right thing and just take Mr. X out of the equation, which will result in many battles. And depending on the difficulty that you choose, you can be guaranteed that it will be a tough experience. But I have to say, looking back, not only is this one of my favourite games that I've ever played on the Sega Mega Drive, but it also has to have, without a doubt, one of the greatest soundtracks I've ever heard in a video game, only bettered by its incredible sequel, Streets of Rage 2. But make no mistake, there is a lot of banger tunes on this game that you really need to listen to. Streets of Rage would end up being a massive hit once it released, so much in a way that there would be a comic series based upon the elements of the game, even diving more into the background of the character's original origins and story. You would often find elements of it in various Sega comics that you would have found in newsagents or magazine stores over the years. And while it did have a good story, I definitely think that the music played a massive part in how good the game ended up being received, with all of the elements of the game being inspired by the legendary Yuzo Koshiro, who is well known to have put his hand to pretty much all of the most iconic games Sega has ever made. They're all masterpieces and they all set the bar really high. If anything, they're the inspiration for what we now see today, and Streets of Rage is no different in that respect. Yes, there was Final Fight on other systems, like Final Fight is also an awesome game. It's an incredible game actually, if you haven't played it. But at its time, Streets of Rage was the best alternative. It's difficult to know if the game was better, but I definitely think the sequel was better, Streets of Rage 2. The original game's soundtrack smashed everything that was out there at the time, it really did. Even just to go back and tell you a little story of my first experience with the game, which was kind of funny. A friend of mine had actually rented out the Mega Games 2 collection, like the game had been out a while, and out of the Mega Games 2 series, which I have covered in a previous video, I'll leave a link in the description, it came packaged with 3 games, with Golden Axe, Streets of Rage and The Revenge of Shinobi. 3 of the greatest games ever on the Mega Drive, in fairness. And while we did play them, myself and my brothers and my mate, because he was staying in our house overnight, we just had a blast. But the game that we probably played the most was Streets of Rage. I couldn't get over how good the game looked, the soundtrack, just the sense of atmosphere and ambience around the game, the colourful graphics, the sound effects when you hit, punched or kicked, or when you threw somebody off a ledge, the combat, the special moves, even the use of the additional features with calling for reinforcements with your cop mates, where they would either use a rocket launcher or napalm launcher and or Gatling gun, depending on which which player you were playing as at the time. Just added so much frantic nature to the game. It was just chaos. But what was even more funnier as well was the fact that my mate only had one Mega Drive controller and we didn't have a second one, so we were trying to figure out, well, what are we going to do? Because we realised that you could play the game in 2-player mode, but at the time we had a Sega Master System because it was the console that we just pretty much had grown up, because we couldn't afford a Mega Drive. Let's just put it this way, people back then were poor, like really poor. So if you managed to get a games console, which we didn't get until I was 10 years old, that'll tell you how bad things were back then. But we always wanted a Mega Drive, so the only way you got to play on any of those consoles was if you had a mate at school or that you grew up with that was lucky enough to have one. That was about it. We, however, were never that fortunate, but we did have a few friends that were luckily enough had a lot of cool games and systems, which definitely helped. But as we were playing the game, we came up with the bright idea of thinking, you know what, we should try and use the Master System controller, even though it only had 2 buttons and it was quite limited, but it had the same controller port and the pins were exactly the same as what would go into the port of the system itself. They were no different between both consoles, and we thought to ourselves, you know what, to hell with it, we'll try it and see what happens. And lo and behold, it worked. Now, there was some caveats. You could walk around and you could punch away to your heart's content, do your combos and stuff, but if you jumped, the game would automatically pause. Now, you could still pull off the moves and so forth in some shape or form, but it wouldn't happen unless you were disrupting the flow of the game, which we did a lot. Try just forgetting ourselves, just pressing the button, not thinking, just jumping. You're like, oh man, what are you doing? But we got there in the end. But at least we figured out a way of how to play it, and that would be a rolling theme that we would use for quite a while after that, because it just meant that even myself and my younger brothers were still able to sit down and play the game in some shape or form. But what was laughable too, more often than not, we'd end up punching the hell out of each other on screen instead of actually beating up the bad guys that were there, and we nearly be killing each other as a result. It would nearly always turn out to a fight, we giving out, what the hell are you doing? But it was a good laugh. That's to say, like, that's why for me it's one of my favourite games, because it was the impact that the game had on everybody. Like, yeah, Golden Axe, don't get me wrong, an absolute incredible game, and we probably played that just as much in many ways, but we would always go back to Streets of Rage. While Revenge of Shinobi, an excellent game, very tough, but it was one player, but it was still very cool, but Streets of Rage was where it was at. So it would make no surprise to say not too long after that the sequel came out, and I remember playing that again over one of my other mates' house that lived across the road, and he had rented it out one night. And what was crazy about that is it was so different. It didn't feel like it was the same game compared to its predecessor. It was hard to really make sense of it at the time, but it was just so good and it just looked awesome. But at the same time, when you had the chance to go around to say a friend's house, and if they had Streets of Rage 1 there, that's the game you would be playing. You could guarantee that's the game you would be playing. Even now, as of recording this video, I went to replay the game and even some of the 8-bit counterparts with the Master System and the Game Gear, and I still had a blast with it. These games are timeless. They're so good, especially the Mega Drive one. It is the best version of any of the games out there in any format. It's so iconic, and it just has that great pick-up appeal that you can just play just on a whim, and you don't find yourself getting bored. You'll always find yourself just revisiting it, and just the nostalgia is ever present every time you switch the game on. And even for me, easily the highlight is the soundtrack. Very like the second game. Even today, I will admit, I will still sit and listen to the soundtracks of Streets of Rage 1, Streets of Rage 2 on a regular basis, even as I'm recording videos, or if I'm doing stuff in the background, or I'm editing stuff, or I'm designing thumbnails, or whatever it is I'm doing, even here on YouTube. I love to listen to music, but I always love video game music. I've always grown up just listening to that as much as my favourite artists. And the Streets of Rage soundtracks, especially that from the first 2 games, I will always go and listen to them on a regular basis. They're just so bloody good. That's why they still stand the test of time. That's why they're among some of the greatest games ever made, because they just have that appeal that if they can be as good now, today, well over 30 years on, which is crazy to think that as of recording this video, the game was released in 1991, it's now 2025. The game is well over 30 years at this point, almost 35 years, and it's just crazy how good it still is. Like, I could go on and on about its nostalgia and everything, but if you've played it like me, you will understand it, and if you haven't played it, you need to see it for yourself. It's an incredible game, the first in an incredible franchise that really spurred on the beat 'em up movement. That and Final Fight really set the stage at that time for everything else that was to come after it. And what's crazy is with this game in particular, you think to yourself that nothing could better it. Well, we wouldn't have to wait long to find out.